Welcome to the Dianne She Looked Up Creative Hour podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Hartfield, and I'm an artist and an entrepreneur. And yes, those two things can go together. This podcast is for the artists, the creatives, and the makers who want to find a way to make a living doing what they love. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Dianne She Looked Up podcast. As always, I'm your host, Melissa, and this week I am really thrilled to be welcoming author and writing coach Dianne Jacob to the podcast. Welcome, Dianne.
Hi, thanks for having me, Melissa.
I am very happy to have you here. For those of you who are in the food writing sphere, I am sure that Dianne's name is very familiar to you, but for those of you who are not in the writing sphere, just give you a little introduction into who Dianne is. She is an author and she coaches food writers and bloggers on how to get a cookbook published and how to improve the quality and effectiveness of their writing. She specializes in book proposals, which have a 1% acceptance rate, which I did not know. We'll talk about that. Dianne is also the author of multiple award-winning books on food, and you probably know her best for her book, Will Write for Food, which has just launched its 4th edition, and we're going to be talking about that as well. She has co-authored 2 cookbooks with Chef Craig Priebe and has judged cookbooks for the James Beard Foundation and the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Prior to that, she was a newspaper, magazine, and publishing company editor-in-chief. She has a blog and a free newsletter aimed at food writers and bloggers. And I'm going to put a link to Dianne's newsletter in the show notes because it is one of the only newsletters I subscribe to that I actually open every single issue. It is an excellent newsletter, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later too. So the big reason that Dianne is here this week is because, as I mentioned, Will Write for Food just launched its 4th edition, which is really exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking a bit more about that later. But Dianne, the first question I ask everybody who comes on the show is, did you feel like you were creative as a kid?
I did. Boy, no one's ever asked me this question before, so it's really fun to think about it. When my sister and I were kids, my father wanted us to grow up to be writers, and so he was a frustrated writer and poet and songwriter, and I mean he was a bookkeeper by trade, but he was a very kind of romantic guy, and he wanted us to write, so he gave us writing assignments. Sometimes we had artists, we could turn in artwork if we wanted. I remember writing poems, and one poem that I remember was about a frog that had a gastrointestinal problem. I can't remember how old I was for that. Yeah, I remember, taking ballet classes and loving my art classes and my writing classes and just enjoying being a creative person.
That's pretty interesting. It's very rare that we have parents who are like, I want you to be a writer. It's usually something I think we tend to get steered away from. So I kind of like that your dad was really into that. That's kind of cool.
Well, I think he was frustrated because he actually wanted to be an opera singer, but that wasn't what nice Jewish boys grew up to be in his very religious families. So he ended up being an accountant, and I think he always wanted something more, so he pushed us in that direction. And my sister became a writer also. I went to journalism school. She went to UBC to English Lit and got her degree, and then she worked for a newspaper on the North Shore of Vancouver for a while until she got pregnant, and then that was the end of that. But yeah, we both went in that direction.
You must have had a love for writing because you obviously didn't rebel against your dad and decide, no, I'm not going to be a writer. That's the direction you went in. So after you finished school, you went on to become a journalist. Did you go to UBC as well? I can't.
No, I went to Langara.
Oh, okay.
Because they had a 2-year journalism program.
And Yeah, we didn't mention this, but Dianne actually was born and raised in Vancouver. So
Yeah.
she now lives in California. So she's still a West Coast girl. But yeah, you went on to become a journalist, and I think you worked for several of the local papers, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I worked for the Chilliwack Progress, the Matsqui, was it the Chilliwack and Matsqui News? I worked for Abbotsford, Mission. Worked for a paper on the North Shore for a while. And then my last job, I was the editor of a city restaurant magazine.
I was just going to ask, how did you work your way into the food realm from being a journalist?
Well, I wasn't trying. I was one of my first jobs out of journalism school. I was, just a section editor and reporter and photographer. And I got recruited by the owner of a Vancouver restaurant magazine, who had actually a terrible reputation and was not well liked. And he recruited me to become the editor of the magazine. So that was my first chance to learn about eating at nice restaurants, which I didn't know anything about eating at nice restaurants. My family's from China, and the only restaurant that we ever went to was Chinese restaurants. The Marco Polo in Chinatown,
right,
was the favorite. So I mean, we had very what would be considered exotic food at home. My parents were Iraqi Jews from China, and they came through Bombay, their families, and so I grew up eating Baghdadi, Bombay food, Iraqi Jewish food, Chinese food, Japanese food, and every once in a while my mother would try to figure out Western food, but she wasn't very good at that, except baking. She loved to bake. But we didn't eat in restaurants, so this was a whole new field for me. And I managed the restaurant critics, but I was also expected to go out and write feature stories. So I got to interview chefs and write recipes. I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote feature articles about restaurants. That part was easy, but I really, fine dining was a very particular thing in that era and has only recently become less of a thing with the rise of basically high-end food that is very affordable and casual. But in those days, you had to go to a white tablecloth restaurant and understand which fork to use, and the menus were in French a lot of the time, and it was very intimidating.
You're taking me back to my childhood when the special night out was going to this restaurant here in Delta called Mama Gina's. It was Italian, obviously, and it was like a big deal. And my brother and I got to have Shirley Temples, and it was like so exciting for us. Sadly, that restaurant is gone. It was a good restaurant. It was very different. It wasn't the Cactus Clubs and the Earls and all the more, like you said, high-end casual dining that we see so commonly today. As you started doing that, what was it that just kind of captured you and kept you and decided this is where I want to be? Or is that something that came and just kind of grew on you?
Well, I loved being a reporter and editor, and I loved figuring out what to write about and covering news. And so all that part I was just madly in love with. But then the man in my life who was a draft dodger who had attended UBC to avoid the draft, he got accepted to law school in LA. And so I was maybe 6 months into that restaurant job where he moved to LA to get ready to start law school. And so I decided I was going with him. So
that's how you wound up in California. Yes. I've always wondered. I never knew how that actually happened. So
yes, he was an American, and it was the very end of the draft. So
right.
It wasn't likely that he was going to get called up, but just to be sure, he was going to UBC. So that just threw everything off, because then I was a foreigner in the United States, and I had a green card because my parents had applied for a green card to move to the U.S. when I was a kid. So I had one from when I was 5 years old. So I had my little 5-year-old face on there. And
could you even do that today?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Wow.
Yeah, it didn't expire, which is so weird, because I was 22 when I left. And, we were living this life of poverty in downtown LA in what became Koreatown. And I worked as a Kelly girl, which is basically you get temp jobs being a secretary and folding brochures and whatever comes up. Nobody would hire me. It was so weird because I was a foreigner, and so they would say, well, how can you do this job? I'm like, well, I've spoken English since birth, and I went to journalism school.
Such a different world, yeah.
So I finally had to go to journalism school in California all over again and get my degree so that I would be taken more seriously. And then my career took off from there, but I was doing restaurant reviewing on the side, but all my jobs, I didn't have any jobs that were in food. My first job out of university was Los Angeles Home and Garden magazine. And it was just one of those really silly magazines where they talked about silk wallpaper, and I don't know. Wasn't really that interested. But then it closed, and the only other magazine that this publishing company did was an international off-road magazine for four-wheel drive vehicles. I was heading out the door because that other magazine folded, and the publisher said, where are you going? I said, well, I'm going to the unemployment office. And he said, well, why don't you try working at this other magazine? I'm like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. International four-wheel drive magazine. I do not think so. And he said, well, just try it, and if you don't like it, we'll go from there. So I actually became the editor of that magazine within about 6 months, and it was a huge magazine. I had a staff of 15 gun-toting, beer-drinking Republican men who could take a vehicle apart and put it back together again, and couldn't figure out how I was their boss.
Oh my goodness, that's making me laugh so hard.
I know, it's crazy. But it was all the same skills that I had learned in journalism school, so I could do it. And of course, I had to learn things like, what is a suspension and what is a lift kit. And
did you learn to grow an appreciation for off-roading through that job?
I did. I had to go off-road, and it was so disappointing to the men because they'd be like, "Oh my God, the editor of the magazine is coming to this event," and then I'd get out of the truck and they'd be like, "What? Who are you?" As you know, I like to create trouble, right?
Yes.
So my favorite thing was to go to an automotive show in Los Angeles, where basically the only women in the show were the booth babes in bikinis who were straddling giant shock absorbers. And I would wear like a silk dress with heels and have long fingernails, and I had long hair and makeup. And then people would want to meet the editor of the magazine. Men would want to meet the editor of the magazine. I'd be like, yeah, hi, what can I do for you? They're like, ma'am, I'd like to meet the editor. I said, yep, what can I do for you? And they just couldn't figure it out, which was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, that's great that you were able to have a very healthy sense of humor about it.
Oh, yes. You kind of had to.
Yep.
It was it was a very sexist time also, and there was a lot of that, and job discrimination. I think my entire staff was paid more than me because they were all men, and I was sexually harassed by a Mormon who was the executive editor, who showed me a photo of his wife naked in the bushes and compared her to Eve and suggested that we take off our clothes and run around the office naked one night when we were on deadline. I'm telling you, it was just nuts. So that's just one job.
Sometimes I don't think we've come that far from that, unfortunately, but other days I have more faith. So.
Yes. So I just continued down that path, being a magazine editor, and then I became a book editor home improvement books, but they were on CD-ROM. Remember CD-ROM?
Oh my goodness, yeah.
This was pre-internet, so
Yeah.
I became the editor-in-chief of this company called Books That Work that created products that were on, like, I don't know, first they were on like 12 discs, and then they were on CDs. And those were the days where computers were still pretty rudimentary, and you couldn't do anything in 3D or anything with graphics, or
Yeah.
you couldn't use a calculator. And so we created products that had all those things in them for home improvement. We got a lot of really good press, won a lot of awards. And then the internet came along, and the CEO, who had worked for Time Life and had a degree from Harvard, couldn't figure out how to refocus. And so, that was the end of that company. That's when I became self-employed.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
When you realized that self-employment was the route that you were going to go down, did you have any idea at that point what it was that you were going to focus on? Or was it like it is for a lot of us when we're first self-employed, where you just take any gig that comes up because you need the money?
Right. Well, I had no idea. I was in survival mode because I had survived 2 years with a very abusive, rageaholic boss who tormented me. He was a horrible, horrible man, and I was just wrecked. And so I couldn't even apply for a job because I had no self-confidence at all after 2 years with him. And he was sort of the anything you can do, I can do better person, because he had been an editor at Time Life. And so, and now he was the CEO, but he still, had his editing chops. And so he really made my life hell. So, yeah, I was basically a mess for the first year. I think I made like $7,000, and it took all kinds of weird jobs. And the thing about being self-employed is that for most people, you have to become an individual contributor. You have to make stuff and sell it. And I was used to being a manager. I was used to having a department, or sometimes several. I had 3 departments at the book publishing company that reported to me. And I didn't, I wasn't writing. I didn't remember how to do anything like that. So that was when I decided that I wanted to work with writers, because I had enjoyed that so much as an editor, and I wanted to keep doing it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start coaching. And then I also thought, well, if I have to become an individual contributor, what is it that I'm going to write about? Because that's what I knew how to do. And I decided that food was the answer to that. I think it was because of my parents that they had such an odd background that they didn't fit in anywhere. They didn't fit in Canada as Jews, because Jews in North America come almost entirely from Eastern Europe and Europe. And so, and they were from China, but they were Iraqi, so no one could figure out what to do with them. And then, because they were from China, we went to Chinatown all the time. But they couldn't communicate with anyone because they only understood Shanghai dialect, and most of the people in Chinatown spoke Cantonese. And so it wasn't, it certainly wasn't the same for them. They grew up with servants, and they didn't know how to cook, and they didn't know how to really do anything. My mother said they lived on matzahs and sardines for the first 3 years after they moved to Canada. And so they really got into their food as a way of remembering who they were and where they came from. And so they figured out how to cook all the foods that they knew. And my father planted a garden, and somehow he grew a lot of Chinese vegetables. He was the eternal optimist. He tried to grow chilies in Vancouver.
Yes,
which,
that's optimistic.
Not the right climate. Anyway, that was why I decided that I wanted to write about food. But then I found out that writing about food was like, it's summer, let's talk about peaches. Or do you know how to serve cheese when you're doing a dinner party? Um, and so it was really a stretch for me to figure out how to write all that stuff, which I didn't, which was okay. It was kind of fun. I think the most fun I had was I won a contest for San Francisco Weekly to become their lead restaurant reviewer. I don't know why you would have a contest for this job, but they did. They wanted me to be edgy, whatever that meant. So I decided that it meant bitchy. So I had a really good time writing super bitchy restaurant reviews. My readers really enjoyed that.
And so that's how you wound your way back into food. It's funny how it all came full circle for you.
Yes. That's a very long answer to your question.
No, it was very interesting though. I was just thinking about your parents in Vancouver at that time, at that point in time, and it must have been Vancouver doesn't have a big Jewish community, period. And then for them to have such a varied background, and Vancouver was not diverse in the 70s and early 80s.
No, and there was a reason for that. It was because of racist immigration laws. It's why most of the people, and same in the United States, it was why most of the people who got to immigrate to Canada were from the UK and Eastern Europe and Europe.
Yeah.
And you could bring in, the Chinese and the Japanese for labor reasons. And that was why they wanted them. In the States, the Chinese got to come in after slavery ended because they needed cheap workers. But in the States, it really wasn't until 1965 that they started letting other people in. Because, Jews live all over the world, and they weren't letting in any Jews from, Yemen, Algeria, Egypt, India. There was a Jewish community. There were synagogues, and there's a Jewish community center, but pretty much everybody is from that part of the world. And it's still hard for me being the daughter of my parents because, I still identify as Jewish. And then Jews want to talk to me about Jewish food, which in their mind is all Eastern European food. And I didn't grow up eating that food. I don't know. I mean, I know what it is, but it's not my food.
It's not what you ate, no. And that kind of gets us into that whole conversation of food and memory and family and the way it connects us all. I think there's so much comfort in food for a lot of us.
Absolutely.
I think, as we get older, you're having a bad day, you go back to those things that your mom made or your dad made and that just made you feel better about everything.
Definitely.
And all of that. So I can see you writing those grouchy restaurant reviews and having a good time with it. I'm not too sure when you started blogging.
Let's go back. So then once I started doing a lot of food writing, which was mostly service writing, I had a column like, okay, here's this roll of yellow polenta at the supermarket. What can you do with it? Is it even edible? Here's some ideas. That kind of stuff, service stuff, and the reviews. And then I decided, well, maybe I'd like to teach food writing. And so I looked for a book on the subject, and there wasn't one. And that was in 2004 when I started writing We'll Write for Food, and it came out in 2005. And I didn't mention blogging because blogging had just started then.
Yeah.
And I was a snobby print person, and I was like, this is just like self-publishing. This is all vanity stuff. There are no gatekeepers. I don't know if this is going to last. I'm not even going to talk about it. So in 2005, I didn't talk about it. And then 5 years later, in the second edition, I had to write like 7,000 words on blogging because it had just exploded, and there was so much to say. It was that was the main way that people were getting into food writing, was to start a food blog. And then, so that was, second edition was 2010. And in 2009, I started a blog because I thought, I don't know how I'm going to write about blogging if I don't have one. Mm-hmm. So I started a blog, but it wasn't a food blog. It was a writing blog for food writers.
Exactly. You took a different...
About how to write a book, how to write feature articles, how to write a blog, how to get a book deal, how to do book promotion, blah, blah, blah.
And you very quickly became a resource for a lot of bloggers. It's so interesting to watch how it's all evolved over the last 15, 20 years, and just seeing how when I first became aware of food blogging, it was more like the restaurant side of things. People were going out for dinner and they would come home and they would write about it and they'd show some photos of it. And at that point, even just inserting a photo into a blog post was a lot of work. You had to use HTML code, and you couldn't just click a button. And that's sort of what I associated food blogging with. I was doing a 365 photo project that had nothing to do with food around that time, but food started to become a theme in it. And it wasn't until I sort of was like, oh, maybe I'll put these on the internet that I realized that there was other people who were doing this. And I was so blown away. And I started blogging in 2003, but not anything to do with food. Yeah, it was over on LiveJournal, which was like the Wild West of blogging. It was such a fun community, actually. I really kind of miss it. But and I was just so shocked by all these people who were blogging about food and who were sharing recipes, and I just thought, this is so interesting to me. And I was fresh out of design school at the time, and I had had a corporate job my whole life, and I was just like, well, this is kind of cool. Maybe there's something here. And I think you became like a resource for a lot of us who really did not know how to write or do anything. We didn't know how to write. We didn't know how to take photos. You see some of these bloggers today who are hugely popular, and they have these very polished websites, and the photography is stunning. The writing is great. And if you go back and see their early days, the photos were orange, and it was all very, it's come a long way. And you really found a way to bring yourself into that community. I mean, your book is like a Bible in the food blogging world. And you are on the 4th edition, and it has changed over the years. You've added things on blogging, you've added things on how to make money from your writing. And what was it that made you think now's the time for an update?
Well, first, I think the first impulse was, every 5 years I had a new edition, but then that would have been last year when the pandemic hit, and publishers were just thrown into chaos, and they didn't know how to plan. They couldn't figure out when should books come out. We don't know how to promote books now because everything is going to be online. So they just put it off until this year, which was fine. But what has changed is that, well, we were talking about restaurant writing. Well, I mean, once Yelp started, people lost interest in restaurant writing because you could just go to Yelp and read reviews. Nobody needed to go to somebody's blog and read about it. And then there's been this giant shift away from going to a restaurant once a month or for your mother's birthday where you were planning to spend a lot of money and it was a fancy place. There's been this gradual shift where we're spending more and more time in restaurants, ordering takeout food, getting takeout food from grocery stores. So it just became less of a thing altogether to write about restaurants. And so that chapter has steadily reduced in size. But I think it's interesting to see how the restaurant reviewers who are left have reinvented restaurant reviewing. And there's the person that I focused a lot on is Soleil Ho, who is the restaurant reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle. And I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's, she was in her 20s when she replaced an older white man who had done, white tablecloth dining his entire career. He'd been at the Chronicle for, 27 years or something. And she identifies as a pansexual person who's married to a man, and she's Vietnamese American, and she had worked in restaurants. So it was just like a whole other scene. And her approach has been really refreshing and sometimes controversial. So that's been interesting, but in general, that whole kind of writing has pretty much gone away. And now food blogging, started out as a hobby, and now it's been professionalized, and people have businesses where they have a website with recipes, but they make their income from this website by doing work with brands, or they might have freelance photography work. And it's just a completely different thing where they're entrepreneurs. So I want to write more about that. And I want to write about voice because the field has gotten very crowded, and there's a lot of people writing the same kind of blogs about America, basically what's American comfort food, Canadian comfort food. It's pretty much the same kind of food. And you got to figure out how to stand out. So you can have beautiful photography. Okay, that would be nice. But then what else? And one of the ways to do that is with voice.
Yes, voice is something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, not just from a writing perspective, but just in terms of finding out whether it's your style, your voice, your, what it is that makes what you do unique to you. And I think just over the years in my other business with Food Bloggers of Canada, I have had to approve well over 2,000 food blogs into our network. And I've looked at every single one of them, and it's when somebody has nailed their voice, they stand out like a beacon because yes. It's so rare to find somebody who is really confident, because I think voice takes a lot of confidence to really come up with being... I'm not going to be very articulate about this, so I'm going to pass this over to you, but you spend a lot of time on voice in this edition. And I think for new writers particularly, it is one of the hardest things to get a grip on. I think it's something that only comes as you do more writing. And even for those who have been doing this for a very long time, we run into these issues where there is a gatekeeper now, and that gatekeeper is called Google. And you are trying to fit your voice to work with SEO and algorithms and all the things up there that kind of want to make us sound the same, because it's easier for machines to figure out what content is about if we all sound the same and we all use the right headings and we all use the right keywords and all these things that you have to think about when you're writing for the internet. So how can somebody develop their voice when they're trying to balance it with these other challenges that you have as an online writer?
Well, first of all, people think it's mutually exclusive, that they cannot have a strong voice and write for the internet. Mm-hmm. And one thing has nothing to do with the other. Really, first we banished storytelling. Bloggers are terrified of storytelling now because gotten so much blowback about how people just want to scroll to the recipe and no one cares about your cat or whatever it is. And there's some validity to that, but voice isn't even necessarily about storytelling. It's about word choices and sentence length and cultural references, and it's about your personality. And you're allowed to have a personality. I mean, who doesn't want to have a personality? So that you have one, and the question is, well, how do you put that on the page instead of just having one in general for your friends and family? I mean, it's so integrated into your being that you don't even know what it is.
That's very true. That's a really good way to look at it.
So you have to figure out what your voice is. Like I said, when I did that, when I was doing those restaurant reviews, that she wanted somebody who was edgy, and I didn't really know what that meant, so I decided that it meant bitchy. And that was fun. But I didn't, that's not necessarily me all the time now. But you can, I have a list of adjectives. Are you evocative, confessional, moody, opinionated, whimsical, self-deprecating, sensuous? And particularly when you're a food blogger, you have two levels of voice, because your first voice is you're a teacher. You're teaching somebody how to make something. And so you have to have a certain voice for that. You have to be trustworthy and knowledgeable, and people feel comfortable with you. You have to be approachable, all that. But then the second layer goes on top of that you are self-deprecating or bitchy or whatever it is. And you know it when you see it. If Smitten Kitchen and David Leibovitz both have a recipe for chocolate chiffon pie, and you read both posts, there's no way that you are going to confuse David Leibovitz with Smitten Kitchen.
Exactly, yeah.
And people understand that, but they don't necessarily understand how to have that voice for themselves.
Exactly. That's the hard part.
David is going to be, there's going to be a lot of storytelling. He might be complaining about how he just finally got his bathroom working again, and his partner gets really mad at him when he can't stop making candy because he wants to put that on his blog, or something about what it's like in Paris where he lives. And Deb, Smitten Kitchen, is going to be, she's going to be very different. She's super enthusiastic, kind of breezy. She's all about cooking is really fun, and I've got kids, and I'm not going to make anything complicated. You can do this, and I hope you're having as good a time as I am. And I live in this little apartment in New York, and it's springtime, so let's do asparagus, So they're very different from each other, even if they're covering the same topic.
So how does a new writer figure out how to develop that voice? Because I think that's so hard when you're first starting out. Especially if you're not comfortable writing to begin with, which I think a lot of people who start food blogs, they don't necessarily realize that they're going to have to do a lot of writing.
It's funny, but that is so true. Kind of an afterthought. And then what I found is, they'll pay these SEO consultants thousands of dollars to help them, and then they come to writing, they're like, no, don't really need any help with that. But you do.
Yeah. You do. You absolutely do. Especially if writing isn't something that you've done through the rest of your life. Even if you work doing tech writing for a software company, at least you have some experience with writing, and you understand what goes into it, even though it's a completely different field. But if you've never written before and it's never been something that you've been drawn to, it's really challenging.
It is.
To figure out.
And the worst thing you can do is take it super seriously, because whenever I do that, my writing is awful.
You just wind up sounding pompous or ridiculous
or boring.
Or stiff or wooden. It just doesn't come off right.
It doesn't come off right. And the people who don't take themselves too seriously, I think, do the best, because they're just having a good time, and they're writing to amuse themselves. So I like that kind of writing, and I like that kind of attitude towards writing. I find that hard to do myself as a teacher, because I'm supposed to be taking myself seriously. But I do advise people to ask their friends to use some adjectives to describe them, like the ones that I was talking about. If they can't figure out who they are, certainly their friends know. And then I also find that the writing that I like the best it has so much energy to it, and it's sort of like you on too much caffeine. Or, you're going to a party. Remember the days when we went to parties? And you're talking to strangers, and it's kind of anxiety producing, and you have to be someone that a stranger wants to talk to. So you have to have your game going on, right? You have to be entertaining to keep this person's interest. And that is the main reason that people read stuff, is they want to be entertained.
Yes. And how many times have we read something where you're just like, ugh, whatever. And you skim through, you just wind up skimming through it because
Yeah.
you're just trying to get to what you want to get to. And
Yeah.
I think too that reading plays a huge role in developing your voice. I think it's really hard to develop a voice if you're not a reader as well.
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
I've been a reader, a voracious reader my whole life, and I just can't see being any other way.
And I think maybe that's something that people who are new to this, maybe that's what you need to do, is start reading a little bit more as well. I'm the same way. I find when I go through long periods of not reading for whatever reason, I'm too busy, I notice that my writing, just my vocabulary seems to shrink overnight.
Yeah.
And I'm not good with adjectives and adverbs and things like that. And once I get back into a reading mode and I'm back to reading regularly, and I have been a voracious reader all my life as well, my writing improves by leaps and bounds. It's really interesting how that works, how your brain sort of manages to mesh the two together.
Well, I think vocabulary has a lot to do with it too, that it's definitely a way to show your voice is by the words that you use. I mean, yesterday I found this, people have been telling me about this Instagrammer who has, I don't know, 650,000 followers. And I started reading her posts and it was like, I must be too old for this because I cannot stand reading about Sandoz and CAE, next word, SALS. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Do you know what that is? It's a Caesar salad.
Oh, okay. Sounds like when I'm talking to one of my cousins via text message. I feel like I need to interpret it.
I know. Like, I'm reading this and it sounds kind of like baby talk and slang and lots of weird spellings. I think I'm sorry. I'm too old. I'm not her target.
But it is interesting. You mentioned something there that I think is so key. And this is something I've noticed from just hosting food blogging events and conferences is, people shell out thousands of dollars for help with SEO and help with the tech side of their blog and show very little interest or willingness to invest that same kind of money or even a fraction of that money into improving their writing. And that's what's going to make them stand out. And I've always been fascinated by that because I don't entirely understand it. But I also wonder if people think that maybe they think that writing is just something that comes to you or it doesn't come to you. I don't know if people realize that there are people out there who can help you with your writing. And I remember one of our members several years ago mentioned that she was in a local writing group where she lives. And I had never encountered another food blogger who did this. I'm sure there are others, but I just asked her why she did it. And she just said, she likes to write and she just wanted to be around other writers and she wanted to just go through the experience of being in a writing group. And she really enjoyed it. And I think that's something that we just don't seem to do very much anymore. And
it's so overwhelming to have a business that's online because you've got all the tech, all the photography, all the SEO, all the uploading and downloading and conforming and, all the promotion of your social media back to your blog because that's where your ads are and that's how you make money and all your brand relationships and your recipe development and who's washing the dishes and who's taking care of your kids when you're doing this, and it can be totally overwhelming. So I do get that.
It is a lot, and the key there is it is a business, and sometimes when you run a business you have to hire people who are experts in things to help you out.
Yes, and that is the people who have become professional, they're not even bloggers. They have like media companies.
Exactly.
Right?
That's what I call them, media companies. It's gone so
and
far
they have
beyond.
recipes on there, but they have a staff. I mean, they have people who write the posts. They have people who, if they don't think they're a good photographer, they can pay someone they just send the recipe over and someone else will take the photo and give it back to them. They have someone who does their Pinterest page and
and they have video production people, and video plays a
People
huge
do the
role.
YouTube videos and
It's a
yeah,
lot. It's a lot. And
yeah.
one of the you spend a lot of time in the book, and this section seems to get bigger every time I see a new edition come out, but you spend a lot of time talking about making money as a food writer. And this has really been interesting, especially over the last year. Food writing, in particular food blogging, has become very prolific, and part of that is because it's become really lucrative
Yeah.
in certain areas. And I know for a long time, food writers, you were a writer, like you have that vision of the starving writer in an attic somewhere.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But these people are making a lot of money, and in many cases it's well into the six figures a year, and in some rare cases more than that. But it's interesting, food bloggers have managed to weather this pandemic quite nicely. And one of the interesting things that I've seen is how bloggers in other niches that did not weather it so successfully, particularly travel. I know travel bloggers just really got hit hard. And it was interesting because a lot of them turned to food. They felt like it was a way that they could make a fast buck by pivoting to food. And I think a lot of them found out just how much work food blogging is. But everyone who listens to this podcast creates for a living and is hoping to create for a living. And we all love to make the thing, whatever it is, the painting, the jewelry, the hand tufted pillows. But at the end of the day, we have to sell the thing.
Yes.
We have to make money. Otherwise, you're going to have a room full of pillows or paintings, and you're not going to have anything in your bank account. And I think one of the things that we have to do is figure out how to bridge this gap between creating and selling and developing our business skills. And you cover a very extensive list of ways that people can earn money from their writing.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard for me to write this section because people aren't necessarily that forthcoming about how they're making money.
No,
so.
I know, and I'm
it's hard to figure it out because I'm not a food blogger and I'm not making that kind of money.
But as you've gone through writing various iterations of the book, what are some of the more unique ways that people are earning money that have caught your attention? Because we know ad revenue, we know sponsored content. Yeah. Those are two of sort of the pillars of food blogging in terms of earning money. But have you seen some people doing other things that have really caught your eye or caught your attention?
Yes. Bryant Terry, who he lives near me. He's written a couple of Afro-vegan cookbooks, and he has carved out a career for himself where he became the creator in residence of St. Paul's Cathedral in San Francisco, which is a really beautiful big church that is a tourist attraction.
And he's the creative in residence?
I can't remember what his title was, but
interesting.
He got this gig, and I'm like, what? How does this work? But he was paid some kind of stipend to be a creative force at this church. And then that ended, and then he got a similar gig at MoFad, and now I've got to remember what that's called. It's a museum of the African American experience, something like that, in San Francisco. And he still has that gig, I think, where he puts on events. Of course, all that, shifted during the pandemic.
Right.
But I thought, this is super creative way to make your way in the world, to have these gigs, because he doesn't want to become an employee for anybody. Right. And so these are his consulting gigs. And then he just got a new consulting gig where he has partnered with 10 Speed Press, which is a very high-end cookbook publisher owned by Random House, where he has his own imprint called Four Color Books. I've just finished interviewing him for a blog post that I'm going to do about how this came to pass. And he is going to, become an editor at a book publishing company.
Wow, that's really cool. And I'm really happy to hear that Random House is the imprint through Random House? Is that
Yeah, through 10 speed. Yeah.
That's really cool. This is one of the other things that I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit, because over the last year or two, the food writing world has really come under fire, rightfully so, for its lack of diversity and some of the whitewashing that has gone on. And I am so happy to see that companies are starting to react to that and find ways to bring more of these voices to the forefront, because I think that's one of the things that does make food writing, when we're talking about voice and things like that, food writing in North America is very white.
Yes, it is.
It's very white.
Publishing is also very white.
Yes. And to be very frank, I find it incredibly boring.
It is. Everyone's writing about the same foods in the same way.
And so I am so excited to see this conversation coming up more. And I noticed that you did this in the book. You brought a lot of different voices in to contribute, which I was so happy to see. It was great.
Yeah.
And I think this is something, it's been a little bit of a reckoning, because I think there has been some pushback in terms of how we write about things, or in terms of how
there's always pushback.
There's always pushback. And yeah. I've, as I said, you like to stir things up. So
yeah.
So I've seen you addressing this both on your blog and in your newsletter, and it's been really great to see. And so I love this story. That's fantastic, and I think that's really cool that he's been doing this.
Yeah. And what's interesting is there are people, because this opportunity exists where you can make a living online and there's no gatekeepers, there have been people of color who have created enormous businesses online. Just One Cookbook, which has, a very non-offensive name. A Japanese woman married to, I can't remember. I think her husband might be Chinese or Korean. I can't remember. Anyway, she has Namiko Chen. Mm-hmm. She has an enormous blog. I mean,
she's been around for a very long time.
She's been around for a long time, but she has a very, very lucrative business. And, she didn't have to worry about how publishing is 86% right, because she doesn't care about getting a cookbook deal. It would take too much of their time to write a cookbook, and they can make so much more money just from their blog. And Walks of Life is another one, an enormous blog, very, very successful. So I just think it's fantastic that they can participate in a way that they can become superstars, whereas otherwise there would be gatekeepers, would make that so much harder.
Yeah. It's I'm glad the conversation has started happening, because this has been one of the things that has bothered me for a while. I'm not as involved in the food writing community in the US as I am in Canada, and this is just something that I've always found really kind of like.
Well, it's not that different.
It's not that different. I'm more aware of who the bloggers are in Canada than I am in the US, and it's like, chocolate chip cookies are great. I love chocolate chip cookies, but I eat my fair share of them. But unless you have something really interesting to say about your chocolate chip cookies, I'm not going to read every single chocolate chip cookie recipe out there, because there's not a lot interesting to say about them if you haven't developed your voice. If Deb Perlman writes about chocolate chip cookies, I'll read it, and she has. And
of course,
it's like that's a chocolate chip cookie post that I would be looking forward to reading. But when your chocolate chip cookie post sounds exactly the same as everyone else's, and you're not bringing anything new to the table, it's really hard to stand out.
Well, I don't know why people are even writing about chocolate chip cookies.
Exactly.
As
We've all it's been written to
10
death.
billion recipes for them online and in many cookbooks, and most people just want to make the Toll House kind anyway because it's the kind they grew up with. So, like, why must you write about what's already out there? I guess because it's comfortable to do that. It's what people know.
I think so. And when you're starting out, I do get it. It's a good way to kind of, get yourself comfortable in the food writing world. But yeah, I'm really happy to see that, that we're getting called out on our behavior and especially because I do think appropriation is something that happens an awful lot, and we've gotten away with it for a very long time, and now people are starting to say, hey, that's not right, and it's not right, and I'm glad to see that it's being brought to the forefront. So because I want to hear more interesting stories. That's why I started the podcast. I just want to hear people's stories. That's what interests me about things. So yes, I'm really happy to see that that's happening more and more, and I hope that continues.
So too.
One of the things I've been getting asked about more frequently over the last few months is paid subscription newsletter models, and I am kind of digging this. I think it's a really interesting, they're not new by any stretch of the imagination, but there are platforms out there now that are making it easier to have these kind of paid subscription type services. And actually, when I first started seeing them, I really thought your newsletter would be a great one for that. I think you could. Have you seen any other writers, food or otherwise, who are doing these as well? Or is this something
sure.
Yeah?
Substack is a big thing right now. There's a lot of buzz about Substack. And here's the thing. If you already have a huge audience, you can make money. With a subscription newsletter. But if you have a very small audience, like, for example, I have 5,000 newsletter subscribers, which is very small. So if I move it to Substack, maybe 10% of them will agree to a paid subscription. So that would be, what's 10% of 5,000? Is it 50? Is it 500? My brain doesn't work. Anyway, whatever it is.
It's 500.
Okay, it's 500 people, and maybe they're going to agree to $25 a year. That just doesn't really come to very much money.
Certainly not enough to support yourself, that's for sure.
I've already got an established audience. So, whereas someone like, I'm sorry to bring up David Leibovitz, but he's a friend of mine. When he started talking to me about moving to Substack, and he thought I should do it too. And he has, I don't know, 45,000 subscribers to his newsletter, and so when he moved it to Substack and then he offered a paid version, the very small number of his audience who were willing to pay was quite a shocking amount of money.
That's
a very nice amount of money. He was surprised.
Really?
But he has a huge audience, so that's why.
Yeah.
It added up to something, because 10% of 50,000 subscribers who are willing to pay is different than 10% of 5,000 subscribers who are willing to pay.
Yeah. It is. I think too, if you start out as paid subscription right from the start, it's maybe a little different because you're training that audience to know that you're going.
Well, you can't on Substack. You start with a free subscription.
Oh, is that how it works?
And then you add a paid option.
I see. Okay.
So once a week you do your free one, and then you say once a week there's this paid option
with more stuff.
That's better, and then you try to convince people that they should pay, an annual amount for that.
I see. Okay, that's how it works. Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting. I've seen bloggers doing other subscription type models, not
Oh,
necessarily
yes.
just newsletters. I've seen people doing meal plans and
Oh, yeah.
all kinds of different
There are
things.
definitely, that's, I mean, the newsletter is just the latest thing,
Hmm.
but there are actually a lot of people in the food community who have been doing paid subscriptions and doing really, really well at them, mostly for meal planning.
Hmm.
Um, that seems to be what people need, right?
Yes, I think.
You send them every week. Okay, this week you're going to make these four things. Here's your grocery list. You're going to use half the meat for this recipe and half the meat for that recipe, and you're going to have a plan.
Yeah, it's been. I'm really impressed with how creative people have gotten, and if you are a food writer or a food blogger and you are looking for ways to make money, Diane's book is a great resource, but it is a great resource for many other reasons. She covers so much stuff in the book. She has a lot on voice. One of the other things, we didn't get to it in this episode, but one of the other things that you spent some time on was self-publishing, which was interesting to me because you mentioned it earlier when self-publishing first came out. It was a vanity thing. That's what was associated with it. But over the years, it has really taken on a life of its own. But it's always been really hard for food because cookbooks are expensive to produce, just visually produce because of the photography and everything.
True.
So it was interesting to see that you had a section on that, which I think a lot of people will be very interested in.
Oh, just to give you an anecdote about that, a friend of mine who started out being my student maybe, I don't know, 12 years ago, has always wanted to do a cookbook. And and she's, bounced various ideas off me over the years. And finally she decided, okay, I'm going to do it. So she picked what's called a hybrid publisher. So the hybrid publisher is somebody who knows how to produce a book, and you don't have to know. And they're going to hold your hand all the way through. They have an editor, they have a book, they have a cover designer, they have interior designers, they understand paper weights and what is a perfect binding versus a spiral binding and where they're going to get it printed. And they're just like a regular publisher, except that you pay them to create your book. So she finally came up with an idea that she liked, and when she first started talking to me, she said it was going to be about $15,000, and now they're up to $40,000.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, because she wanted X number of recipes, she wanted X number of photographs. Yeah, that's what she's paying, and so the question with self-publishing is still, it all comes down to the same thing. It doesn't really matter what your product is do you have an audience that wants to purchase it?
Yes, it's
Otherwise, you're going to have like 5,000 books in your garage and you have to figure out what to do with them.
yes. I mean, there are options now where you can do print on demand and things like
Yes, you
that, but
can.
it's still there's still pricey books. I mean, cookbooks are you're not buying a novel, you're not buying a pocketbook, right?
Yeah.
So they do tend to be more expensive just because of the type of books that they are. But yes, there's a fantastic company out of Vancouver, Page Two Publications, I think, or
Yes.
publishing
Yeah.
that does the hybrid model. And they're really interesting. I had the opportunity to meet the woman behind that company pre-pandemic when we could still go out.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. They I think they have done a couple of cookbooks, but they tend to focus more on nonfiction.
Hmm.
But there are lots of options out there now that we didn't have 5 years
Yes.
ago. So that's really interesting, and I think that will
Well,
continue.
that option existed for cookbooks for a long time, but they were it was sort of like, okay, your church wants to do a
Yeah.
cookbook they can sell at rummage sales, and
Yes.
so you're going to get this spiral bound book that has no photos in it, and there's 3 recipes per page, and they're for something using
Yeah. I have a box full
cocktail
of
fruit.
those.
And, yeah.
And those, you know what? Some of those are some of the best cookbooks I own, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, because they didn't, no one thought about where those recipes came from, right? So a
No.
lot of them came from cookbooks and magazines.
Yeah, or they were just recipes that your family has had forever and you don't really
Mm.
know where they came from. Like they must have come from somewhere, but
They came, yeah, well, that's where they came from. They came from cookbooks and magazines.
yeah, it's Gabby Payton, who's been on the podcast. She's a food writer out of Newfoundland, and she actually has a book coming out soon with Appetite. But this is her thing is food history, and we've had many conversations over the community cookbooks that
Yeah.
have popped up all over Canada throughout our history. So yeah, there's just a lot of history in them. There's something very comforting about them.
They're that's a good way to describe them.
Yeah,
But
they're
there have
just
always been publishers who will help you make that kind of a cookbook. And
exactly.
it's the same model as hybrid publishing. Now they just will help you make something much more high end with glossy paper and beautiful photos. That's hardcover, that looks like a book that you would buy in a bookstore.
There's a lot to be said for doing a book that way, just from a branding perspective. You know, we talk about blogs being media companies now, and that's just another way that you can reinforce your brand, is by having that beautiful coffee table cookbook that
Yes.
people want to look at.
Yes.
Oh, well, Dianne, it has been so much fun to have you here. You and I could talk for hours, I know, and
Good.
but you've been very generous with your time. The book is out now, the fourth edition, and if you are a food writer and you do not own a copy, you need to go get yourself a copy. I'm sure it is available on all the usual channels.
Yes, it is. And I have to say that I do hear from people who are not food writers who just think of it as a good book about writing.
It is. There's so much in there. You cover so much. It's such a great resource. It's one that I keep on my shelf and that I've referred back to many times. I have the last cover with the utensils, which is my favorite. Just
Okay.
that one's just so bright and cheerful. I just love it. But you write a lot about the craft of writing. As we talked about, you write a lot about voice. There's a ton of information in there on writing a book proposal and going through the publication process. Things that people, I don't know, traditional publishing always feels like a bit of a mystery, like it's shrouded in and you really break it down and make it very approachable. You also offer a lot of education for food writers, and I don't know what you've been doing with that pandemic wise, because I know you really like to teach in person. We've had you come out to some of our events. Are you doing online workshops or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I've been teaching a class called So You Want to Write a Cookbook, which is just a 3-hour Zoom class. And then I started doing a class on writing book proposals, which was 9 hours over 3 weeks, where you actually start writing it in class, and then you have a draft at the end.
Okay. And for those of you who are interested in that, we're going to post links in the show notes.
I do coaching for people who want to improve their writing, want to write a book proposal, want to build their audience, want to start a blog, want to improve their blog, all kinds of topics. Want to be a freelance writer. And so through your podcast, I'm offering 10% off my coaching services.
10% off your coaching services. I will put a link to that with the details also in the show notes. If you do not subscribe to Dianne's newsletter, I highly recommend it. It is, it's one of my favorite things about your newsletter is you have this incredible list of curated links in every issue to some of the most interesting examples of food writing, but also some of the most interesting articles on the craft of writing and also the tech behind it. It's such a really well-curated list. There's always something on there that I find really interesting. And
Thank you.
And it is one of the only newsletters that I open every single issue, usually within 5 minutes of it dropping in my inbox, which is very rare. So I highly recommend it. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. She has a fantastic blog with tons of resources. She's also brought on a lot of really interesting guest writers onto her blog who always have something interesting to say. And as I mentioned, Dianne likes to stir things up to get people talking and thinking. And that is one of the things that I love about having you on the show or coming to our events. It's always fun to talk to you. So I appreciate it very much. All right, everybody.
For me, see you.
I know, and I hope that soon you'll be able to come up to Vancouver and we can go for coffee or something. That would be great.
As soon as they open the border, baby.
I know, soon. Once again, the book is Will Write for Food. It's the 4th edition. You will be able to find it on Amazon, and I'm sure Chapters Indigo has it, and all your usual book places. Are you actually selling it directly on your website as well? Or can people...
No, but I think if someone asks me if they can get an autographed copy, I'll send it to them.
Oh, that's nice of you. Anyway, it's she's updated it 4 times now, and every time it just becomes more and more useful. So I highly recommend it. Even if you've bought a copy before, Dianne was generous enough to give me a peek at the new version, and there's lots of good stuff in there. So it's really worth taking a look at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dianne. It was great to have you on the show. And for all of you listening, thank you very much for being here this week. And I will be back next week with another new episode. I'll talk to you all then. Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. If you're looking for links or resources mentioned in this episode, you can find detailed show notes on our website at andshелookedup.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter for more business tips, profiles of inspiring Canadian creative women, and so much more. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show via your podcast app of choice so you never miss an episode. We always love to hear from you, so we'd love it if you'd leave us a review through iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Drop us a note via our website at andshелookedup.com or come say hi on Instagram at andshелookedup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.